Let me warn you ahead of time, we're going to read about businessmen who, by today's standards, were bad businessmen. But we're going to read why, we're going to talk about why they believed that what they were doing was right. When I was in high school, our history book said that it's hard to look back on this period without a sense of shame. And as we go into the chapter, you understand why. A lot of persons were out just to make money, and there were a lot of get-rich-quick schemes. We'll learn about some of the men, a few of the men who really made it rich quick. Now, but most of them didn't. Mark Twain, you may know Mark Twain was the author of books like Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. He was against corruption, and he had seen a lot of corruption during the administration of President Ulysses Grant. But he took on some get-rich-quick schemes. I mean, yes, he made some money on his books. Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn gave him some money. And instead of living on that money, he tried to get really rich, rich as some of the richer men of the day. He failed. And he wound up filing for bankruptcy in his old age. Sad end to an otherwise capable man. The nation's first big business was railroads. And as I already mentioned, the United States had more railroads than all of Europe and Russia combined. But into this scenario stepped a man named Gould. Now, this morning's class had a hard time understanding, but I'm going to try to explain as best I can. There is a stock market out there. The stock market exists. But nobody knows what the value of stock is at any time. Well, we know what it was yesterday. But what's the value of stock today? Well, folk, you never know, so you can only speculate. And what will the value of stock be tomorrow? Well, Jay Gould started out small in the railroad business, but got a lot of money, owing to the fact he started off buying stock in a railroad that was failing. So he got the stock cheap. Because he got it cheap, he was able to undercut the competition, in other words, sell at a lesser price, so the other rail stocks went down, while his stock went up. Well, then once his stock went up, he sold his stock at a profit and bought the stock from other railroads and used them to undercut other railroads still. And when his stock went up in his railroad, he would sell it at a profit. But he did nothing to improve the railroads. Basically, the railroads he bought were very poorly run, and he would do nothing to make them, he'd do nothing to help them be able to be good means of transportation. Just all he cared about was reaping a profit. Now, the one thing though he did right, he did build the second transcontinental railroad, and it was well managed. But otherwise, there was a decline. Now, the railroads depended on telegraphs, so the telegraph lines, the railroads and telegraphs made an agreement that the telegraph companies allowed to put their poles next to railroad tracks, just like you drive along and you might see electric power poles next to the road. Again, that's because the government owns the land. Well, the railroads owned the land that the tracks were on, and also the railroads needed those telegraph lines because in some places there's only one track. And what if a train started out over here on the same track as the train started over here? They'd bump head on into each other. So they needed a telegraph to make sure when this train started out over here that there was no other train that was going to encounter head on the track. Now eventually more and more tracks were laid with double tracks, but there were still some single tracks. But anyway, Jay Gould, realizing that the railroads and telegraph lines need each other, he wound up buying the cheapest of the telegraph stocks and eventually got the controlling stock in Western Union. Western Union is still the nation's big telegraph company. The railroads built more than they needed, and they eventually fell on hard times through oversupply, overproduction. Jay Gould built a lot of railroads himself in an attempt to help bring the price down. That the Great Northern Railroad, though, that he built was well planned and prospered. The other railroads he built just for the sake of putting money into his own pocket. Well, the stock market was the way a lot of men bought railroad stock cheaply and undercut the railroads. Again, the value of stock has never been clear-cut, and that's still true to this day, 2019. When Gould died, he realized he was the most hated man in America. He was only concerned with putting money in his own pockets, at least except for building the one railroad that went to the West Coast. Other than that, he was only concerned with putting money in his own pockets, and he was not concerned with delivering goods or service. But now, unlike Gould, Carnegie worked to deliver a product. Now, when you're learning these men, what you learn, what they're associated with. In the case of Gould, railroads and telegraphs. In the case of Carnegie, steel. Before Carnegie's time, steel was made by a process called puddling. Puddling is where men with really, really long poles would remove the impurities off of melted steel. And if you remember, steel is heavy, and if you melt steel, the impurities will float to the top, generally, and the steel itself will go down to the bottom. Well, puddlers would remove the impurities off the top, but then Carnegie worked with the Bessemer process, which was a different way, a better way of making steel, and it made better quality steel than the old way. Now, he is called vertical integration. That is, he controlled the mining of the iron that was used to make steel. Then this iron, once mined, was put on trains. Carnegie controlled the trains, controlled the mining, controlled the trains. So the miners, I mean, there was no mining company that made a profit. Carnegie felt like, I don't have to make a profit here. Transportation, again, he owned the transportation, so no need to make a profit here. Then came the processing. Carnegie did not worry about making a profit here. But then he sold the final product. He could sell it at a cheaper price because other companies would have to pay the miners who made a profit, pay the railroads, so they had to make a profit. Carnegie didn't, so he could undersell. That way there was never any profit paid in Carnegie's steelmaking from the time it got out of the ground as iron ore to the time it got to the outsider. All the profit went to Carnegie himself. No money went to an outsider. He overworked his workers, underpaid them. He had pitted one manager against another and basically said to the managers that produce less, the ones who produce less, I'm going to fire you. So the managers had all kinds of incentive to pay their workers as little as possible and see to it that they were busy all the time, working them a lot of times without a break. It was politics, management like this that wound up making unions strong. His steel was used to build not only bridges and skyscrapers, but to build battleships, eventually to build tanks, but that was to come later, but to build better cannon, better guns, and build a lot of other things better, and help make the United States a world power. The United States Navy quit building ironclads and instead made steel ships, and the steel ships were very, very large, and they got larger and larger as time went on. Now, Carnegie, associate him with steel. Moving on to John D. Rockefeller, he wound up taking over 90% of the nation's oil, in that he did not own the railroads. But when he went to a railroad company to ship his oil, when he went to a railroad company, he would tell the railroad company, give me a rebate. In other words, basically pay me for the privilege of me shipping my oil through you. And the railroads would give him a rebate. So he would make money, not have to spend money so much to ship, but he'd actually make money by shipping through the railroads. And sometimes the railroads actually paid him for the privilege of shipping his products. Rockefeller started the trust. The trust was simply where a bunch of companies would get together, and I say, well, they trust you. That's where the word trust comes from. And they would agree that they would not have any competition among each other, And all this wound up guaranteeing Rockefeller a monopoly, which meant that Rockefeller basically controlled all the oil, and the other people who were trust under him, they had to do his bidding, obey his orders. Now, how many of you played the game called Monopoly? In this morning's class, well, a couple of you raised your hand. You can generally win a Monopoly game if you get control of the railroads. Now, if any of you know differently, your input is welcome, but the few Monopoly games I have won, and there have been only a few because I don't play it that much, but the few I have won by controlling the railroads. That was a lot true in those days too. Rockefeller became very unpopular. He would go into a town, and like for instance, if there was an oil company that sold kerosene, and a lot of the lamps, they were lit by kerosene. This is before the electric car. Kerosene was also even used in cleaning. Well, if this store was selling kerosene, he'd put his store right there within sight of the first one, and then he would undercut. You might say, how could he underprice this one? Because he was making all of his money from all of his other stores all over the country. So he could undercut this one until he put this one completely out of business. Then once he got control of all the kerosene in that town, he could jack up the price, go to the next town and do the same thing. And he put a lot of small companies out of business. And basically he became unpopular. Now, how could he justify this? We'll talk about that in a little bit. Meat packing. The old ways of leading meat to market changed when somebody invented the refrigerated railroad car, so the cattle then could be killed, slaughtered and gutted, and all that would be left of would be their meat. Then this meat, cattle meat, was put in refrigerated railroad cars and shipped to wherever was needed. And of course this brought the price down because the cattle did not have to be fed or grazed while they were in the railroad cars. But the problem with it was it led to the Indians having to relocate and the near extinction of buffalo, was more and more people got into the ranching business. Heinz, yes, we still have Heinz ketchup, even though the original owner of Heinz is long dead, but Heinz began to market vegetables and ketchup, and Heinz ketchup is still a very popular brand of ketchup. Mass production. In other words, well, it might take $1 million to develop a computer chip. Then once you've got all the bugs ironed out of that chip, you can keep making until you made about 1 million chips and sell them for $30 or $40 a piece. And due to something called mass production. Same with books. It might take an author months to write a book, and if he sells a lot of them, he'll get the money back for his time. Telephone, invented by Alexander Graham Bell. I want to elaborate on that a little bit. Actually, 70 men claimed that they had invented a phone. When the technology was right, a whole bunch of men, but Alexander Graham Bell's claim was upheld by the courts because he sent his friend Watson upstairs, and Watson talked through what we today would call a microphone. It was basically a diaphragm with a coil of wire wrapped around a magnet. And Watson talked into this coil of wire, and Graham Bell on the other end heard him through a coil of wire also, a coil of wire that was wrapped around a magnet, and the magnet attached to a diaphragm. But Graham Bell documented the exact time this occurred. He said, wait, Watson, I heard you clearly, and he wrote down the time. And then when he went to court in case after case, Bell's claim was upheld by the courts because he documented the time, and he and Watson could verify that yes, this was the exact time when I first heard Watson's voice. The other men who invented the phone had not been that good at their documentation, so Bell got the patent, and he was the founder of the Bell Telephone Company, which as far as I know still exists. Now, I must say, folk, the Bell Telephone Company of that day in no way resembles the phones we use today. The radio had not yet been invented. That meant that every phone had to be connected to every other phone by means of wire, just like the telegraph had. The wireless or the radio did not yet exist. The biggest inventor of all time, Thomas Edison, invented the light bulb. Now, the world history book that this school has used ever since I hired in here 19 years ago will say that Joseph Swan invented it in Europe the same time Edison invented it in the United States, and gives credit to both men. Be that as it may, Thomas Edison made more patents than any man up to his time. He got more patents. Among them the phonograph, that's the little record player that we still have around. They're not used much anymore, but the phonograph, the motion picture camera, and the motion picture movies he invented. Weirdly enough, though, when it came time to play his motion picture, his movies were silent. And he never did figure out how to get the movies to coordinate with the sound. It took other men to realize that, hey, you've got to put the sound on a track beside the picture and not try to put the sound on a separate track. He tried to get the sound to play on a different track than the picture, but the sound would either go ahead of the picture or lag behind the picture, and try as he might, he couldn't get it all to go at the same speed. In those days, motors were not accurate to the same speed. You couldn't get two motors to work at exactly the same speed. Anyway, Edison had another weakness. He only used direct current. He did not understand alternating current. Direct current will not flow more than 2 miles before it becomes seriously weak. Nevertheless, Edison tried to market direct current. General Electric came along and they realized, hey, to get electricity to go for miles and miles, you have to use alternating current. And they decided on 60 cycles. Now, if you go to Europe, Europe uses 50 cycles and 200 volts. In the United States, our standard is 120 volts or 110 volts, 60 cycles. How many of you know what I'm talking about? Okay, regrettably, one of you raising your, one of you is nodding your head like you do. But anyway, Edison, he and General Electric had a falling out. General Electric once used Edison's name, but they dropped Edison. Again, I think the issue was over alternating current. And Edison's name was left off, and today it's just General Electric, by the way, still exists. General Electric made the engines that we use at Lockheed for a big C5. And if you go to Ohio, you'll see the big GE plant. But if you're going north, it's on the right side of the road. Huge GE plant. And one of my classmates worked there until he died of a heart attack. And he became a foreman even. All right, now how did these men justify, not Edison so much, but men like Rockefeller and Gould and Carnegie, how did these men justify their moral standard? They credited Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin came up with a theory of evolution in 1859, in which he said the strong survive and the weak don't. This is not necessarily true. Chance has a whole lot to do. And he called it survival of the fittest. Well, the fittest do not necessarily survive. Particularly, in the case of rabbits, only 1 rabbit in 10 rabbits will live to be a year old, except for the ones that are raised as pets, but only 1 in 10. And the most fit rabbit just barely has a better chance of surviving the least fit. The fit survive, yes, but the fittest, not necessarily. Hey folk, I used to think that fish grown in hatcheries were not as good as the fish in the wild, because the fish grown in hatcheries, most of them, 99% would not have survived long enough to grow up in the wild. But they're just as good. They're still fish, and the hatcheries protect them from being eaten by other fish until they're a certain size, and that way the hatcheries can restock the oceans, the lakes, and the rivers. But the fish that are grown in hatcheries are just as good a fish as the ones that aren't. But if they had grown up out in the wild, most of them would never have grown up. Anyway, I'm going to get back to Charles Darwin later in this chapter, and also when we come to the chapter on Scopes trial, which occurred in 1924. Bankers began to do their part to organize businesses. We'll talk more about that when we come to J.P. Morgan. But the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the trust monopolies, and this made it difficult. Congress passed antitrust laws because, after all, men like Rockefeller and Gould had made themselves unpopular. But the courts do not have to stand up for re-election, and they initially ruled in favor of the trust. Now, that's not true in the courts today, but in those days. Now, J.P. Morgan, you associate him, folk, with banking and money. Again, Gould with railroads. Gould with railroads, Rockefeller with oil, Carnegie with business, Morgan with money, banking. He hated competition, and here's why. Competition meant some people go out of business. Some people are hurt. So he sought to have central control to where everybody profited, and everybody shared their profits, again, through his banks. He got a lot of business to merge. Now today, there are laws against mergers. You have to get the approval of the courts to merge and the approval of some bureaucrats in Washington. But anyway, he got the railroads together, removed all competition for the railroads, so when one railroad moved the company, moved products, it would not hurt the other one, and they would all share in the business thanks to Morgan and the banks. He issued more shares of railroad stock than the companies actually had. In other words, he might issue $2 million to a company only had $1 million in value, and he'd issue. Now, in the long run, in the short run, it seemed to work, to help. But in the long run, this hurt the railroads. Again, the railroads were quite corrupt in their younger days. All right. Morgan, oh yes. Morgan went to Andrew Carnegie when he heard that Carnegie was out playing golf on a golf course. So Morgan went to the golf course with a bunch of his men and said, "I'm willing to buy your company." And to his surprise, Carnegie sold it. Carnegie said that I could have asked for more than I did, and might have gotten it. And as for Morgan, he said if he'd asked for more, I'd have given it to him. But basically, Morgan bought Carnegie out. Carnegie then went on to move to Scotland, the home of his ancestors, and more or less retire. Morgan took over the steel, Carnegie Steel, and formed U.S. Steel. U.S. Steel did not have a monopoly on steel. It only owned like 40% of the steel in the country. But nevertheless, they formed what's called an oligopoly, from the Greek word oligarchy. And in Greek politics, an oligarchy was a city-state that was controlled by the rich. So basically, a few other steel companies got together and formed an oligopoly, where they sometimes kept down competition among themselves, but they also did a lot to destroy the smaller companies. Now, he controlled billions of dollars. When he died, your book gives a figure. A lot of the other rich people, like men like Carnegie and Rockefeller, said, "Hey, we thought he had a lot more money than this. He didn't have much money at all. He had about, $10 million, which to men like Carnegie and Rockefeller, that was nothing. But Morgan controlled, because he controlled the banks. He controlled multiplied millions of dollars, controlled much, much more than he actually had." All right, back to Darwin. Charles Darwin believed that the unfit should be basically done away with. If a person is weak and sickly, don't help them recover because they're less than fit. Let the fit survive, the fittest, the fittest survive, and they will evolve humanity into a better bunch of humans. Now, folks, hey, this is not me talking. This is Charles Darwin. But a lot of people began to believe that. And they said the poor should not be helped. They got to be poor because they're less intelligent than the rich. Folks, don't go out of here and tell people that I'm teaching this. I don't believe it. But nevertheless, I'm mentioning it because Darwin believed it, and the people who followed him, they believed it. Hopefully you understand me. But the poor should not be helped. And they also began to believe. Now, folk, Charles Darwin, you might have heard that the title of his book is The Origin of Species. What you probably have not heard was that the real title of his book was On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection. That means the strong killing off the weak. For the preservation and enhancement of the favored races. In other words, the favored races were to do away with the unfavored races, and this fueled racism. Some people believing that some races were better than others. The word race did not appear in the human vocabulary until Charles Darwin. Now, Adolf Hitler used Darwin as an excuse to kill off 15 million people, 6 million Jews, and a lot of gypsies, and a lot of other people he considered undesirable. And in our own country, Margaret Sanger used Darwin as an excuse to sterilize, secretly sterilize, a lot of poor people, a lot of people who appeared to be less intelligent than others. Now, I've had some black men write papers in favor of Adolf Hitler. Before any of you do that, make sure you know that Adolf Hitler sterilized every black person he could get his hands on. This is documented, folk. This is true, because he wanted to eliminate the race. But then he had to sit in the stands in the 1936 Olympics and watch while Jesse Owen, who was the fastest runner in the world, outran all the other runners. Anybody heard of Jesse Owen? From what ethnic group was he? He was an African. Basically, he was a black man. He made the Olympic team, and he was from the United States. He made the Olympic team for the best of reasons. He could outrun everybody that he ran against. So the United States sent him to the 1936 Olympics, where Hitler sat in the stands and watched. Hitler also had to watch while Joe Louis, now some of you younger folk might, but Joe Louis was a black boxer, defeated Max Schmeling. Max Schmeling was a superior Aryan white boxer. And now I need to wash my mouth out. No, all right. No, Max Schmeling, all right. Max, actually, they fought 3 times. Max Schmeling won the first fight. Then Joe Louis came back and whipped Max Schmeling a second time, so they had a third fight. And Joe Louis won the third fight. Joe Louis was to hold the world championship for 12 years, longer than any other man up to that time. Now, and again, I'm going to do the best I can, but I'm running out of time now, but I'm going to do the best I can to refute evolution, to refute Darwin's theories when we come to this chapter on the Scopes trial. Essentially, folk, to me, DNA has all but disproven evolution and rendered evolution, as Darwin taught it, impossible. And with all respect, Darwin did not know anything at all about DNA. DNA was not discovered in the 1930s, and then the word A in DNA stands for acid. It was just some acid found in a human cell. No, it actually controls heredity. Now, you've probably never been asked this before, but can any one of you tell me how a gene can move from one chromosome to another? If you haven't been asked that before, it's because nobody wants to tell you this. Okay, how can a gene move from one chromosome to another? I'll give you a hint. I don't know. Fact is, I'll give you another hint. It can't. But what if one gene actually did? Then the creature it moved from one chromosome would be seriously deformed. But what if enough genes move to create a workable organism, a workable entity? Well, unless that creature, a member of the opposite sex that had the same genetic deformations, the line would end right there. And this would be true all the way up. Every time a genetic change occurred in the DNA of a creature, it would have to meet with a member of the opposite sex that had the exact same DNA occurring. Now, folk, the molecules of air in this room have a better chance of forming a piece of paper like this than DNA has of forming a new gene. Genes are extremely complex. Have any of you happened to see a car just put itself together in a junkyard with a bright new chrome finish? I haven't seen it. It doesn't happen. Every car you see that looks nice and shiny and new had a designer, had a team of engineers that designed it, and a team of men that put it together. All right, I'm going to come back to that, believe me. Anyway.